The email sat on Joan Miller's screen like a loaded gun. 28 years of loyalty, and they wanted her to sign off on falsified safety reports that would put patients at risk. Her hand hovered over the mouse. One click meant keeping her pension, her reputation, everything she'd built. The other click meant war. Stephen Collins had chosen war 2 years ago. They'd destroyed him. She clicked anyway. But let me take you back to the beginning to show you how a woman who played by every rule for nearly 3 decades became the person who clicked that mouse and changed everything. Joan Miller arrived at Meridian Pharmaceuticals headquarters that Tuesday morning at 7:15, same as she had for 28 years. Her employee badge told a story if you looked closely enough. The photo from 1997 showed a younger woman with hopeful eyes, an administrative assistant, printed beneath her name. Now, that same badge read Senior Compliance Officer, though the woman wearing it had earned every gray hair in her practical bob and every line around her tired blue eyes. She nodded to Marcus, the security guard who'd been there almost as long as she had. "Morning, Marcus. How's your daughter doing at college?" "Dean's List again, Ms. Miller. Thanks for asking." He smiled, hitting the button that unlocked the executive elevator. Some things never changed at Meridian. Joan always asked about people's families. Marcus always called her Ms. Miller, even though she'd told him 100 times to call her Joan. The elevator rose smoothly through the gleaming glass tower that Meridian had built 5 years ago when they'd become Wall Street's darling. Joan remembered the old building, cramped offices with rattling radiators, but there'd been something honest about it, something real. This new tower was all polished marble and floor-to-ceiling windows, designed to impress investors and intimidate employees in equal measure. Her office was on the 14th floor, tucked between legal and human resources. It wasn't corner office territory. That was reserved for executives like Ethan Harris, the CEO whose face smiled down from every earnings report and industry magazine. But Joan's office was hers, earned through night school and grit, and refusing to quit when everyone expected her to. She unlocked her door and stood for a moment in the threshold, taking in the space that defined her. Diplomas lined one wall, associate's degree completed while working full-time and raising 2 kids. Bachelor's degree finished when she was 41. Certifications in pharmaceutical compliance, regulatory affairs, quality assurance. Each one represented late nights and sacrifice and the bone-deep determination to prove that a woman from a working-class family could make it in this world. On her desk sat a framed photo from her 25-year service award. Joan shaking hands with Ethan Harris, both of them smiling for the camera. She'd been so proud that day. Ethan had called her the conscience of Meridian in his speech, and she'd believed he meant it. Next to that photo, in a smaller frame, was her father's union card. Thomas Miller, Local 247, Steelworkers. He'd carried that card until the day the factory closed, taking his pension and his dignity with it. Joan kept it on her desk as a reminder of why she worked so hard, why she'd vowed never to be powerless the way her father had been powerless. She settled into her chair, the same one she'd had for 12 years, worn comfortable by long hours, and opened her laptop. Her morning ritual was sacred. Review overnight safety reports, check for regulatory updates, scan internal incident logs. Being senior compliance officer meant being the person who made sure Meridian did things right, who protected patients and maintained the integrity that pharmaceutical companies were supposed to have. Joan believed in rules, believed in systems, believed that if you worked hard and played fair and followed the protocols, the system would protect you. Her father had believed in unions and loyalty, and the company had destroyed him anyway. But Joan was smarter than that. She'd worked within the system, become part of it, made herself indispensable. The irony of that belief wouldn't become clear until much later. She poured herself coffee from the pot she'd started brewing. Cheap office coffee, but she'd learned to love it, and began clicking through reports. That's when she noticed the first irregularity. It was small, almost missable. an adverse event report from the previous quarter that had been reclassified from serious to moderate. She pulled up her own notes from when she'd reviewed the initial report. The patient had experienced severe respiratory distress requiring hospitalization. That wasn't moderate by any definition. Joan frowned, making a note to follow up. Probably just a clerical error. These things happened. But then she found another. And another. 5 reclassifications in the quarterly report for their new flagship medication, a breakthrough treatment for autoimmune disorders that Ethan Harris had personally championed. The medication that was supposed to secure Meridian's future and make everyone's stock options worth a fortune. Her coffee grew cold as she dug deeper, cross-referencing her archived documentation with the official quarterly reports. The numbers didn't match. Adverse events had been systematically downgraded. Incidents that should have been reported to the FDA had simply vanished from the final documentation. Someone had changed the reports after she'd reviewed them. Joan sat back in her chair, her heart beginning to pound in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee. This wasn't a clerical error. This was deliberate manipulation of safety data. This was exactly the kind of thing that destroyed pharmaceutical companies and, more importantly, hurt patients who trusted that the medications they took had been honestly evaluated. She printed everything, her hands shaking slightly as the pages emerged from her printer. Then she did something she'd never done in 28 years. She made copies and put them in her bag. She told herself it was just backup, just being cautious. But some part of her already knew. Some part of her recognized the moment her life was about to split into before and after. She brought her concerns to her direct supervisor, Richard Phillips, a nervous man who'd risen to Director of Regulatory Affairs by never making waves. He listened to her presentation with growing discomfort, his eyes darting to his closed office door as if he expected someone to burst through it. "Joan," he said when she finished, "I appreciate your thoroughness, but I think you're reading too much into some routine classification adjustments. The medical team reviews these reports. They have the expertise to determine appropriate classifications." "The medical team?" Joan leaned forward. "Richard, I've worked with the medical team for 15 years. This is my area of expertise. These aren't judgment calls. These are clear misrepresentations of serious adverse events." Richard's jaw tightened. "Joan, I'm going to give you some advice. Focus on compliance, not clinical interpretation. That's not your lane." It was the first time in their 10-year working relationship that Richard had ever suggested she wasn't qualified to do her job. The message was clear: drop it. Joan didn't drop it. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her modest apartment staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the numbers. 15.8% adverse event rate reported internally. 2.3% in the official quarterly report. The medication was being fast-tracked for FDA approval. Doctors would prescribe it. Patients would take it, trusting it was safe. At 2 a.m, she got up and made tea, sitting at her small kitchen table in her bathrobe. Her divorce had been finalized 15 years ago. Her ex-husband, Tom, had finally had enough of being married to a woman who cared more about her job than her family. He'd said it during one of their final arguments. "You're married to that company, Joan, not to me." He'd been right, in a way. She'd missed soccer games and parent-teacher conferences and anniversaries because there was always a crisis at work, always a report that needed reviewing, always something more important than the life she was building at home. Her kids had grown up and moved away, calling dutifully on birthdays and holidays but never lingering on the phone. They had their own lives now, and Joan had her work. Except work was supposed to mean something. It was supposed to be about protecting people, about making sure that when someone's mother or daughter or husband took a medication, they could trust it wouldn't harm them. That's what had kept Joan going through the long hours and missed moments, the belief that her work mattered. Now someone was asking her to sign off on lies. She returned to work the next morning with a plan. She would go to Donna Martinez, the Director of Human Resources. Donna had been at Meridian almost as long as Joan. They'd come up through the ranks together, had coffee together once a week, shared the particular exhaustion of being women over 50 in a company increasingly dominated by aggressive young executives who thought experience was less valuable than a prestigious MBA. Joan found Donna in her office, a space that somehow managed to feel warm despite the corporate sterility of the building. Donna had photos of her grandchildren everywhere, their smiling faces a reminder that there was life outside these walls. "Joan, come in." Donna smiled, but it faded when she saw Joan's expression. "What's wrong?" Joan closed the door and sat down. "Donna, I need to talk to you about something serious. I found discrepancies in our safety reporting, significant ones." She laid out what she'd discovered, watching Donna's face shift from concern to something that looked almost like fear. When Joan finished, Donna was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very carefully, "Joan, have you reported this through official channels?" "I spoke to Richard. He told me to focus on my own lane." Donna nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she already knew. "Joan, I'm going to ask you something as a friend, not as HR. Do you remember Stephen Collins?" The name hit Joan like cold water. Stephen Collins, brilliant scientist, medical director, the kind of person who actually cared about the science instead of the stock price. He'd left Meridian 2 years ago under circumstances that were never quite explained. The official story was that he'd resigned to pursue other opportunities, but the whispers told a different story. "What happened to Stephen?" Joan asked. Donna looked at her closed office door, then back at Joan. Her voice dropped. "Stephen questioned the safety data for a different medication, asked too many pointed questions in too many meetings, made Ethan uncomfortable." She paused. They audited his entire career, found minor expense report discrepancies from 5 years earlier, things everyone did, like claiming a lunch that was partly personal. They accused him of fraud, fired him for cause, fought his unemployment claim. His wife left him. He couldn't get another job in the industry. Last I heard, he's working retail. Joan felt something cold settle in her stomach. Was he right about the medication? Donna met her eyes. It was pulled from the market 18 months after he was fired, but by then, no one remembered his name. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. "Donna," Joan said carefully, "are you telling me to stay quiet?" "I'm telling you to think very carefully about what you're risking. You have 7 years until full retirement. Your pension, your stock options, you've earned all of it. Don't throw it away. People could get hurt." "People get hurt every day, Joan. You can't save everyone. You can only save yourself." Joan left Donna's office feeling like she'd been physically struck. Donna Martinez, her friend, the woman who'd shared countless lunches and confidences, had just told her that protecting her own comfort was more important than protecting patients. But the worst part was that Joan understood the calculation. At 62, starting over wasn't an option. Her retirement plan depended on those 7 more years. She had no spouse, no family money, no safety net. If she lost this job, lost her pension, what would she have? She spent the rest of the week in a fog of indecision, going through the motions of her work while the unsigned quarterly reports sat in her inbox like an accusation. Ethan Harris's office sent 2 follow-up emails, each one more pointed than the last, asking when she would provide her sign-off. The tone shifted from polite request to barely veiled pressure. "We need your compliance signature to finalize the quarterly submission. Please prioritize this." Joan found herself watching Amber Nelson, a 28-year-old analyst who reminded Joan of herself at that age. Hungry, idealistic, determined to prove she belonged. Amber stopped by Joan's office several times that week with questions about protocols and procedures. She looked at Joan with such admiration, such belief that doing good work meant doing the right thing. Joan wanted to warn her, wanted to tell her that idealism had an expiration date, that the system chewed up people who cared too much. But she didn't. She just answered Amber's questions and sent her back to her desk, this bright young woman who still believed that merit and integrity mattered more than obedience. On Friday afternoon, Joan received a meeting request from Ethan Harris himself. Subject line, quick chat about quarterly reports. Time, end of day. The message was clear. This wasn't optional, and it wasn't going to be pleasant. Joan spent the afternoon preparing, pulling up every regulation, every protocol, every piece of documentation that supported her concerns. She told herself that if she just presented the facts clearly enough, if she just made Ethan understand the risk, he would see reason. He was the CEO. He had a responsibility to patients, to shareholders, to the law. Looking back, she couldn't believe she'd been that naive. At 5:30, she rode the elevator to the executive suite, her folder of documentation clutched in her hands. Ethan's assistant, a polished young man who probably made more than Joan despite being fresh out of business school, ushered her into the corner office with its panoramic view of the city below. Ethan Harris stood by the window, looking out at his kingdom. He was 52, handsome in that carefully maintained way of executives who had personal trainers and expensive haircuts. His suit probably cost more than Joan's monthly rent. He'd transformed Meridian from a mid-tier pharmaceutical company into a billion-dollar enterprise in just 7 years, and Wall Street loved him for it. He turned when she entered, his smile warm and practiced. "Joan, come in, come in. Can I get you something? Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine, thank you." "Please sit." He gestured to the chair across from his massive desk, then settled into his own leather throne. "I want to talk about the quarterly reports. I understand you have some concerns?" Joan opened her folder, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mr. Harris, I found significant discrepancies between our internal safety documentation and the reports prepared for FDA submission. Adverse events have been systematically reclassified or omitted. The medication's safety profile as presented doesn't match the actual data." She walked him through it, showing him the side-by-side comparisons, the missing reports, the changed classifications. She'd prepared this presentation carefully, made it impossible to misunderstand or dismiss. Ethan listened, nodding occasionally, his face thoughtful. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "Joan," he said finally, "I appreciate your diligence. I really do. That attention to detail is exactly why you've been so valuable to this company for so many years." She waited for the but. "But I think you're looking at this through too narrow a lens. These classification decisions weren't made by some junior analyst. We have a medical advisory board, people with MDs and PhDs, experts in their fields, who reviewed every single one of these reports. They determined that these adjustments were medically appropriate." "The Medical Advisory Board?" Joan kept her voice level. "Can I see their rationale for these specific reclassifications?" Something flickered in Ethan's eyes. "That's privileged medical decision-making, Joan. You know that. I know that we have federal reporting requirements. I know that serious adverse events require specific reporting timelines. I know that what I'm seeing in these final reports doesn't match what's in our database." Ethan's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Joan, let me be frank with you. We have responsibilities that extend beyond any single report. We have a responsibility to our shareholders. We have thousands of employees whose jobs depend on this company's success. We have patients all over the world who need access to innovative treatments. Sometimes compliance means understanding the bigger picture. Compliance means ensuring patient safety. That's not negotiable." The temperature in the room dropped. Ethan's practiced warmth evaporated, replaced by something harder. "Nothing is non-negotiable, Joan. Let me tell you what I see when I look at these reports. I see a company that's invested $800 million in developing a medication that could help millions of people. I see regulatory hurdles that were designed in a different era, before we understood modern, Statistical methods. I see adverse event classifications that rely on judgment calls, not black and white definitions. And I see a senior compliance officer who's being asked to use her judgment and experience to help us navigate those complexities. You're asking me to sign off on false reports. I'm asking you to be a team player. I've always respected your principles, Joan, but I need to know, are you with us or not? The question hung in the air between them. Joan felt it for what it was, a threat dressed up as corporate speak. I'm with patient safety, Mr. Harris. That's what my job is. Ethan's expression hardened. Then let me be very clear. Sign the reports by Monday morning or I'll find someone who will. And Joan, you might want to think very carefully about your future here. You've got, 7 years to retirement? Be ashamed to lose all that now over some paperwork. Joan stood, her legs somehow steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Is that all, Mr. Harris? That's all. Have a good weekend, Joan. Think about what matters. She walked out of his office, past the assistant who didn't meet her eyes, into the elevator that carried her back down to her floor. She went to her office, closed the door, and sat in the dark for 20 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. The CEO of her company had just explicitly told her to falsify federal safety reports and threatened her job if she refused. Joan drove home on autopilot, her mind racing. She heated up leftover soup she didn't taste and sat at her kitchen table staring at nothing. Her phone rang. Her sister Judith, her weekly Friday night check-in. Joan almost didn't answer, but she knew Judith would worry. "Hey, Judy. Joan, what's wrong?" Sisters always knew. "Nothing. I had a hard day at work." "Talk to me." So Joan did. She told Judith everything, the words pouring out in a rush. When she finished, Judith was quiet for a long moment. "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know." Joan's voice cracked. "Judy, I'm 62 years old. If I lose this job, who's going to hire me? I have 7 years until I can retire with full benefits. 7 years. What if Dad was wrong? What if fighting doesn't matter? It just gets you broken. Do you remember what Dad used to say?" Judith's voice was gentle but firm. "The only thing worse than losing a fight is not fighting at all." Dad lost everything. Dad lost his job. He never lost himself. Can you say the same if you sign those papers? Joan couldn't answer that. After they hung up, she sat in the dark of her apartment, thinking about her father, thinking about Stephen Collins working retail, thinking about the patients who would take that medication, trusting that someone had made sure it was safe. At 11:47 p.m., Joan opened her laptop and wrote a formal memo documenting her concerns and her refusal to sign the falsified reports. She attached all her evidence, the original incident, reports, the altered versions, the regulatory requirements being violated. Her finger hovered over the send button for 10 full minutes. If she sent this, there was no going back. Ethan Harris had made the consequences clear. Her career would be over. Her pension would be at risk. At 62, she'd be starting from nothing. But if she didn't send it, she'd have to look in the mirror every day knowing she'd chosen her comfort over patient safety, knowing she'd become exactly what she'd always despised, someone who saw wrong and looked away because standing up was too expensive. Joan thought about her father's union card on her desk at work, thought about the man who'd stood up to factory management knowing it would cost him, thought about how she'd vowed never to be powerless like he'd been. She'd spent 28 years proving she could succeed by working within the system. Maybe it was time to accept that some systems were broken, that working within them didn't change them, it just made you complicit. Joan clicked send at 11:47 p.m. on a Friday night. Then she closed her laptop, poured herself a glass of wine, and didn't sleep at all. If you've ever felt that knot in your stomach when you knew something was wrong but speaking up felt impossible, you understand what Joan was facing. Drop a heart emoji if you're still with me. This is where everything changes. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Joan dressed carefully in her best navy suit, the armor she wore for difficult days. She arrived at the office at her usual time, swiped her badge, and rode the elevator up to 14. Her office door was locked, which was strange because she never locked it. She tried her key. It didn't work. A woman from IT was waiting nearby, looking uncomfortable. "Ms. Miller, I need to escort you to the basement level. Your office has been relocated." Relocated. The word was too polite for what it meant. Joan followed the IT woman to the basement, where dim fluorescent lights flickered over cramped storage rooms and mechanical equipment. Her new office was windowless, barely larger than a closet. Someone had moved her furniture down, stacking boxes on her desk. "Building optimization," the IT woman muttered, clearly embarrassed to be part of this. "Sorry, Ms. Miller." Joan stood in the doorway of her new prison and made a decision. She wouldn't let them see her rattled. She carefully unpacked her belongings, hanging her diplomas on the dingy walls. She hung her father's union card first, centered where she'd see it every time she looked up. Amber Nelson found her mid-morning, her young face shocked. "Ms. Miller, this is awful. Why would they move you down here?" Joan looked up from organizing her desk, keeping her voice steady. "It's just an office, Amber. The work is what matters." "But everyone's saying—" Amber stopped herself, biting her lip. "Let them say what they want. I know why I'm here." And she did. This was retaliation for her memo. This was punishment designed to humiliate her, to make her quit, to send a message to everyone else about what happened when you didn't cooperate. The basement office was just the beginning. Chapter 2. That afternoon, Joan was summoned to Human Resources, not to Donna's office, but to a conference room where a corporate attorney named Marcus Webb waited with a folder thick with documentation. "Ms. Miller, please sit down." His voice was professionally neutral, the tone of someone delivering bad news as a job responsibility. "We need to discuss some performance concerns." He slid the folder across to her. "Performance Improvement Plan," the cover sheet read. Inside was a litany of complaints Joan had never heard before: failure to collaborate effectively, resistant to management direction, inability to adapt to evolving business needs. "You'll have 30 days to demonstrate meaningful improvement in these areas," Webb continued. "We'll have weekly check-ins to assess progress. Failure to meet these standards will result in termination." Joan read through the document, recognizing it for what it was: a paper trail to justify firing her. Every complaint was subjective, impossible to disprove, designed to build a case. She'd seen the company do this before, to employees they wanted gone but couldn't fire outright. "And if I refuse to sign this?" "Your signature acknowledges receipt, not agreement. But refusal would be noted as insubordination." Joan signed, her hand steady. Let them build their case. She was building one too. She spent the next 2 weeks systematically documenting everything. Working late in her basement office after everyone else had gone home, she copied files to external hard drives, safety reports that had been altered, emails discussing the need for flexibility in adverse event classification, internal memos about fast-tracking FDA approval despite outstanding safety questions. She was stealing proprietary information, violating her confidentiality agreement, committing acts that could get her arrested. But she told herself that some laws were less important than others, that patient safety trumped corporate secrecy. Late one night, when Joan was buried in documentation, Amber Nelson appeared in her doorway. The younger woman looked around the depressing basement office, her expression troubled. "Ms. Miller, what are you doing?" Joan looked up from her computer screen, exhausted. "My job, Amber." "Everyone says you're in trouble, that you refused to sign off on important reports, that you went over people's heads, that—" She stopped, seeming to realize how it sounded. "I don't believe them. I know you. You wouldn't make trouble without good reason." Joan was quiet for a moment, torn between wanting to protect this young woman and wanting to warn her. "Amber, let me ask you something. If you knew something was wrong, really wrong, dangerous wrong, What would you do? I'd report it. That's what we're supposed to do. And if reporting it meant losing everything, your job, your future, your reputation? Amber's confidence faltered. I don't know. I'd want to think I'd do the right thing, but... She looked at Joan with new understanding. That's what you're doing, isn't it? That's why they moved you down here. Go back to your desk, Amber. You have a bright future. Don't let my problems become yours. But Amber didn't leave. She stood there, wrestling with something, before finally saying, if you need help, if you need someone to verify anything, I have access to the safety database. I could... No. Joan's voice was sharp. Absolutely not. They'll destroy you and you have your whole life ahead of you. Promise me you'll stay out of this. Amber reluctantly nodded and left, but Joan saw the look on her face. That mixture of admiration and fear, idealism meeting reality. Joan hoped the girl would be smart enough to keep her head down. On a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after her basement relocation, Joan received an email that made her blood run cold. It was marked urgent, flagged high priority from Ethan Harris's office. All hands meeting Monday at 10 a.m., attendance mandatory. We'll be presenting our quarterly results and celebrating our success. Joan knew immediately what this meant. The falsified reports had been submitted. The medication she'd tried to stop was being presented as their flagship success, and Ethan wanted everyone there to witness his triumph and her defeat. That weekend, Joan barely left her apartment. She kept thinking about Stephen Collins, about how he'd tried to fight and been destroyed, about the medication he'd questioned that was eventually pulled, but not before it had harmed people. Not before it was too late. Sunday night, she sat at her kitchen table with a decision to make. She could attend the meeting and stay silent, keep her head down for the remaining 6 years and 9 months until retirement. Accept that she'd tried and failed, that some battles couldn't be won, or she could do something that terrified her more than anything she'd ever contemplated. She could speak up in front of everyone. The thought made her physically ill. Joan wasn't a public speaker. She wasn't confrontational. She was someone who worked behind the scenes, who fixed problems quietly, who believed in order and hierarchy and proper channels. The idea of standing up in front of 200 employees and challenging the CEO directly, it went against everything she'd ever been. But then she thought about those patients, about the adverse event reports that had been buried, about the 15.8% who'd experienced serious reactions that were being reported as 2.3%, about doctors who would prescribe this medication trusting the data, and patients who would take it trusting their doctors. At 2 a.m., Joan pulled out her father's old union speeches, transcripts her mother had saved, chronicling his fights with factory management. She read his words about standing up when standing up was hard, about how silence in the face of wrong was its own kind of wrong. Thomas Miller had lost everything for his principles, but he'd been able to look himself in the mirror. Could Joan say the same if she stayed silent? Monday morning arrived too quickly. Joan dressed in her best suit again, added her mother's pearl earrings for courage. She arrived early and went to her basement office to review her documentation one more time. Then she printed a single page, a comparison of the reported adverse event rate versus the actual rate, with the regulatory requirements highlighted. At 9:55, she rode the elevator up to the auditorium level, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The auditorium was filling up, 200-plus employees, from junior analysts to senior directors, everyone except the executive team, who would make their entrance after everyone else was seated. Joan found a seat in the middle section, not too far back to seem like she was hiding, not so far forward as to seem aggressive. Amber Nelson was a few rows ahead, sitting with other young analysts. Joan watched the girl laugh at something her colleagues said, carefree and confident. She envied that innocence. At exactly 10 a.m., Ethan Harris strode onto the stage with his executive team trailing behind him like pilot fish following a shark. He was all charisma and confidence, his smile bright under the stage lights. "Good morning, Meridian family." His voice boomed through the speakers, warm and inclusive. The crowd responded with polite applause. "What a quarter we've had. Record revenues, pipeline expansion, and I'm thrilled to announce that our flagship medication is tracking ahead of schedule for FDA approval." The presentation began, slides flashing across the massive screens, revenue graphs trending upward, market share increasing, stock price climbing. Everything was growth, success, triumph, the American pharmaceutical dream. Then came the slide Joan had been dreading. The medication she'd tried to stop, presented with its safety profile. Excellent tolerability, adverse event rate of 2.3%, comparable to placebo. Joan felt bile rise in her throat. That number was a lie. A deliberate, calculated lie that would convince doctors the medication was safer than it actually was. Ethan continued, praising the development team, thanking the Regulatory Affairs Department for their partnership in bringing this breakthrough to market. Joan knew that partnership was code for compliance in covering up the truth. "Before we open for questions, I want to personally thank our compliance team." Ethan's gaze swept the auditorium. "Their dedication to our mission of bringing life-saving medications to patients has been invaluable." The words were poison dressed up as praise. Joan's hands clenched in her lap, the printed page crumpling, slightly in her grip. "Now," Ethan said, his smile magnanimous, "I'm happy to take questions." Hands went up around the auditorium, safe questions about market projections and hiring plans and office renovations. Ethan answered each one with practiced ease, the confident leader guiding his company to greatness. Joan's heart hammered against her ribs. Her mouth went dry. Every instinct screamed at her to stay silent, to let this moment pass, to survive another day. Then she thought about the patients who would trust that 2.3% number. She stood up. The motion caught people's attention. Heads turned. The executive team on stage noticed. Ethan's eyes found her in the crowd, and for just a second his smile faltered. Joan's voice came out steadier than she'd expected, amplified by the microphone someone held out to her. "Mr. Harris, I have a question about the safety profile you just presented." The auditorium went silent. Everyone in that room knew Joan had been demoted. They'd seen her office relocated, seen the signs of someone in trouble. And here she was, standing up, speaking out. "Joan." Ethan's voice was warm but carried a warning. "Of course, though these technical details might be better discussed in a smaller setting. I think patient safety metrics are exactly what this forum should address." Joan's hands were shaking, but her voice didn't waver. "The adverse event rate you showed, 2.3%, doesn't match the incident reports filed in the last quarter. The actual rate based on internal documentation is 15.8%. That's more than a rounding error. That's a significant discrepancy that affects how doctors will prescribe this medication." Gasps rippled through the auditorium. Amber Nelson's head whipped around, her eyes wide. The other executives on stage shifted uncomfortably. Ethan's practiced smile stayed in place, but his eyes went cold. "Joan, you're clearly confused about how we classify adverse events. These classifications follow FDA guidance and were reviewed by medical experts. We'll discuss your misunderstanding offline. Next question?" "I'm not confused." Joan's voice grew stronger. "I've been documenting pharmaceutical safety for 28 years. I know the difference between appropriate classification and data manipulation. And I know that the reports submitted to the FDA don't reflect the actual safety profile documented in our internal systems." The silence in the auditorium was deafening. Everyone stared at Joan, some with shock, some with admiration, most with the horror of people watching a car crash in slow motion. Ethan's mask slipped completely. "Ms. Miller, you're out of line. This meeting is concluded. Everyone back to work." He strode off the stage, his executive team scrambling after him. The auditorium erupted in whispers as people filed out. Joan stood frozen in place, shaking now that the adrenaline was fading, barely believing what she'd just done. Amber pushed through the crowd to reach her. "Ms. Miller, are you okay? What just happened?" Joan looked at the young woman's frightened face. "I told the truth, Amber, that's all. But they're going to fire you. Everyone knows they're going to fire you." "Probably." Joan's voice was surprisingly calm. "But at least everyone knows now. At least it's not a secret anymore." She walked out of the auditorium on legs that felt like water, past colleagues who suddenly found the walls fascinating, past managers who looked at her like she'd set herself on fire. She went down to her basement office, closed the door, and sat in the dark for 20 minutes, processing what she'd just done. She'd just committed career suicide in front of 200 witnesses. Her phone buzzed, an email from HR. "Report to conference room 3B immediately." Joan almost laughed. They weren't wasting any time. But before she could stand, something unexpected happened. Her computer pinged with an incoming email, then another and another. Personal messages from colleagues she barely knew, sent from personal email accounts, not company addresses. "Thank you for saying what needed to be said. I saw the same discrepancies. I'm glad someone had the courage to speak up. You're braver than all of us combined." And then, an email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line read, "You're not alone." Joan opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a file. Incident reports she'd never seen before, documentation of other safety issues that had been buried, internal memos discussing how to manage regulatory concerns. The email had no signature, just a single line. "Someone has to stop them. Keep fighting." Joan stared at the screen, tears blurring her vision. She wasn't alone. Other people had seen the corruption and collected evidence, waiting for someone brave enough or crazy enough to stand up. She forwarded everything to her personal cloud storage, then deleted the forwarding record from her sent folder. If they were going to fire her, she was making damn sure she had ammunition. The meeting in conference room 3B was exactly what she expected. Marcus Webb, the corporate attorney, with his impassive face and professional neutrality. He informed her that she was suspended immediately, pending investigation into her grossly inappropriate conduct during the company meeting. "You'll receive written notice of termination within 48 hours, he said. "Your access to all company systems has been revoked. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings." "What about my pension?" Webb's expression didn't change. "That will be determined during the investigation. Given the serious nature of your misconduct, theft of proprietary information, violation of confidentiality agreements, public defamation of company leadership, there may be grounds to contest your pension eligibility." Joan felt the floor drop out from under her. 28 years, and they were going to try to take everything. Not just her job, but her retirement, her security, everything she'd worked for. "I documented safety violations," she said quietly. "That's whistleblower activity. It's legally protected. You disrupted a company meeting with false allegations. That's insubordination." Webb closed his folder with finality. "Security is waiting." The walk to her basement office, flanked by 2 security guards, was the longest of Joan's life. Employees peered out of offices as she passed, some sympathetic, most just grateful it wasn't them. She packed her belongings into a cardboard box, her diplomas, her photos, her father's union card. 28 years reduced to a single box of memories. As the guards escorted her to the parking lot, Joan passed Donna Martinez, standing in a hallway. Their eyes met. Donna looked away first, and Joan understood. Donna had chosen survival. Joan couldn't even be angry about it. She understood that choice viscerally now. She drove home in a daze, the box of her professional life sitting on the passenger seat like a tombstone. In her apartment, she set it on her kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. Then she did something she'd never imagined doing. She opened her laptop and searched for Christian Hunt, investigative journalist. His articles populated her screen, in-depth investigations of corporate corruption, pharmaceutical fraud, financial crimes. He'd taken down executives and exposed cover-ups. He was thorough, relentless, and according to his bio, interested in tips about corporate wrongdoing. Joan's finger hovered over the contact button. This was the point of no return. If she contacted a journalist, she wasn't just a fired employee, she was a whistleblower. She'd be making herself a public target, inviting scrutiny not just of Meridian, but of her entire life. They'd dig up every mistake she'd ever made, every unflattering moment, every vulnerability. But patients were going to be hurt if someone didn't stop this. Joan clicked the contact link and began typing. She kept it simple. I have documentation of systematic safety data falsification at a major pharmaceutical company. Patients are at risk. I'm willing to go on record. She hit send before she could change her mind. 3 hours later, her phone rang. Unknown number. Ms. Miller, this is Christian Hunt. I got your message. Can we meet? They met at a coffee shop an hour outside the city, far enough that Joan felt safe from Meridian's eyes. Christian Hunt was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with intense eyes that missed nothing. He had a worn leather messenger bag and the slightly rumpled look of someone who spent more time working than sleeping. Thank you for reaching out, he said once they were settled in a corner booth. I've been following Meridian for 3 years. I know what they did to Stephen Collins. Joan's head snapped up. You know Stephen. I interviewed him after he was fired. He gave me everything he had, but it wasn't enough. No smoking gun, just his word against theirs. They destroyed him so thoroughly that no one would believe him. Christian leaned forward. But you're different. You're still inside, or at least you were until recently. You have current documentation. That changes everything. They fired me this morning. I know. It's already on the industry news sites. Meridian parts ways with senior compliance officer. Their PR machine is fast. He paused. They're going to come after you the same way they went after Collins. Character assassination, legal threats, making you unemployable. I can't stop that from happening, but I can make sure it matters. I can make sure people know the truth. Joan wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, kneading its warmth. What do you need from me? Everything you have, documents, emails, recordings if you have them, and your willingness to go on record, name, face, full story. If I do this, I'll never work in pharmaceuticals again. Christian's expression was sympathetic but honest. Ms. Miller, you're never working in pharmaceuticals again anyway. They've already made sure of that. The only question is whether your career ends in silence or whether it means something. Joan thought about Stephen Collins, about the medication he'd questioned that was pulled too late, about the patients already taking the medication she'd tried to stop. I have documentation, she said, lots of it, and I have evidence of other people who wanted to speak up but were too afraid. Can you get me in touch with them? I don't know who they are. Someone sent me files anonymously. Christian nodded, unsurprised. That's how it starts. One person is brave enough to stand up publicly, and suddenly others find their courage. But I need to be clear with you. Once I publish this, there's no taking it back. Every detail of your life will be scrutinized. They'll find every mistake you ever made and use it against you. Are you prepared for that? Joan thought about her DUI from 30 years ago, about the performance improvement plan, about everything Meridian could twist into evidence of her being unreliable or vindictive. I'm 62 years old, she said quietly. I spent my entire adult life building a career, trying to prove I could succeed on merit and integrity. And it turns out the system I believed in was rotten. If I don't do this, if I walk away now, then everything I believed about myself was a lie. So yes, I'm prepared. Because I don't have a choice. Not if I want to be able to live with myself. Christian pulled out a legal pad. Then let's start from the beginning. Tell me everything. They talked for 4 hours. Joan walked him through the timeline, showed him the documentation on her laptop, explained the regulatory violations and patient risks. Christian took notes, asked pointed questions, occasionally stopped to clarify technical details. Finally, he sat back, looking at her with, Something like awe. This is bigger than I thought. This isn't just one medication, it's a pattern. Years of burying safety concerns, pushing out employees who ask questions, prioritizing profits over patients. Can you prove it? With what you've given me, and if I can get others to come forward? Yes. But Ms. Miller, I need you to understand what you're signing up for. When this publishes, you become the face of this story. You'll be painted as a disgruntled employee. Maybe worse. Are you sure you want your name on this? Joan thought about her father's union card, about Amber Nelson's idealistic face, about all the patients who would never know how close they came to being harmed. Use my name, she said. All of it. Joan Elizabeth Miller, Senior Compliance Officer, 28 years at Meridian Pharmaceuticals. Let them try to discredit me. I've got the documents to back up every word. Christian smiled, a real smile this time. There's one more person I want you to meet, someone who tried to fight this battle before you. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Stephen, it's Christian. I'm with someone I think you should meet. 20 minutes later, Stephen Collins walked into the coffee shop, and Joan finally met the man whose ghost had haunted her journey. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 50, but his eyes looked older, carrying the weight of someone who'd been through war. He slid into the booth across from Joan and studied her for a long moment. You're the one who stood up in the company meeting. You heard about that already? I still have friends there. They called me an hour after it happened. His expression was complicated, respect mixed with concern. They're going to destroy you. You know that, right? They already fired me. They're going after my pension. What else can they do? Stephen laughed, but there was no humor in it. So much more than you can imagine. They'll audit every expense report you ever filed. They'll find colleagues to say you were difficult to work with. They'll leak selective information to make you look incompetent or vindictive. They'll tie you up in lawsuits until you're bankrupt. They'll make sure your name is poison in this industry. He paused. They'll make sure you lose everything like I did. Joan saw the toll it had taken on him, the cheaper clothes, the weariness, the defeat lurking behind his eyes. Why are you here? She asked. If it's to convince me to stop, you're wasting your time. I'm here because Christian asked me to tell you the truth about what you're facing, and because... His voice caught. Because I couldn't finish the fight. My wife left me. My kids stopped calling. I had a breakdown. I was hospitalized. And eventually, I just... gave up. He looked at her directly. I've lived with that decision for 2 years, knowing I was right. Knowing people got hurt because I wasn't strong enough to keep fighting. It eats at me every single day. The medication you questioned, they pulled it eventually? 18 months too late, after it had harmed hundreds of people. People I could have protected if I'd been stronger. His hands clenched on the table. Don't let them break you, Joan. Please. Not everyone gets a chance to finish what I started. Joan reached across the table and gripped his hand. Then help me finish it. You have documentation, right? Evidence they couldn't use before because you had no platform. Stephen looked at Christian, then back at Joan. Slowly, something changed in his expression. The defeat giving way to something harder, something that looked almost like hope. I have everything, he said. I never deleted anything. I couldn't. I kept thinking maybe someday it would matter. It matters now, Christian said. With both of your testimonies, with the documentation from both cases showing a pattern, we can take them down. That night, Joan drove home with Stephen's promise to send her everything he had and Christian's commitment to publish the story. She felt lighter than she had in weeks, despite knowing the worst was yet to come. She was right about that. The termination letter arrived by courier the next morning. It was brutal in its completeness. Terminated for cause due to gross insubordination, violation of confidentiality agreements, and conduct, Chapter 3. The termination letter was brutal in its completeness. terminated for cause due to gross insubordination, violation of confidentiality agreements, and conduct detrimental to the company's reputation and business interests. Her pension was under formal review. All stock options were declared forfeit due to misconduct clause violations. 28 years of work erased with corporate efficiency. But worse was the letter from Meridian's legal team that arrived 3 days later. They were suing her personally for $2 million. The allegations read like a thriller novel: theft of trade secrets, breach of fiduciary duty, defamation, tortious interference with business relations. Joan sat at her kitchen table reading the lawsuit, her hands shaking. $2 million. She didn't have $2 million. She didn't have $50,000. The lawsuit wasn't meant to be won. It was meant to destroy her, to bury her in legal fees, to terrify anyone else who might consider speaking up. It was called a slap suit, her lawyer explained, when she finally scraped together enough money for a consultation. Strategic lawsuit against public participation. They know they'll probably lose eventually, but they can drag this out for years. It'll cost you everything you have to defend yourself. That's the point. What are my options? The lawyer, a tired woman named Patricia, looked at her with sympathy. Declare bankruptcy, which would stop the lawsuit but destroy your credit. Try to settle, which means signing an NDA and recanting your allegations. Or fight it, knowing you'll probably go broke in the process. Joan thought about the patients who would take that medication, trusting the safety data. What if I had evidence that proves everything I said was true? Even with evidence, they can keep this in motion long enough to bankrupt you 3 times over. They have unlimited legal resources. You have... Patricia glanced at Joan's intake form. Minimal savings and no income. Joan left the consultation feeling physically ill. That night, she couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, just paced her apartment calculating how long her savings would last. 8 months, maybe 10 if she was careful. Then what? Christian Hunt's article published that Sunday. The headline hit like a bomb. The Meridian Cover-Up: How a Pharmaceutical Giant Silenced Safety Concerns. It was thorough, devastating, and meticulous. Christian had woven together Joan's story with Stephen's, showing a pattern going back 8 years. He'd included expert analysis of the falsified reports, quotes from former FDA officials about the regulatory violations, and anonymous testimonies from current Meridian employees too afraid to go on record. And there was Joan's name, her photo, her entire story laid out for the world to read. The article went viral within hours. Major news outlets picked it up. Social media exploded with discussion. Hashtags formed: Justice for Whistleblowers, Meridian Cover-Up, Protect Patients. But for every supportive comment, there were 10 that made Joan's stomach turn. Disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. She was fired for incompetence, and now she's trying to get revenge. How convenient that she suddenly discovers these safety concerns right after being terminated. Meridian's PR machine had sprung into action immediately. Ethan Harris gave interviews to friendly media outlets, his charm in full effect. We're saddened that a former employee has chosen to make false allegations rather than accept accountability for her performance issues. Ms. Miller was terminated after a documented pattern of professional shortcomings, and we believe her claims are an attempt to distract from her own failings. They released selective portions of her performance improvement plan to the press. Conservative media outlets ran with it. Woke employee tries to destroy company rather than admit failure. The real victims are the thousands of Meridian employees whose jobs are threatened by one woman's vindictive lies. Joan's personal information leaked online. Her home address, her phone number. She started receiving calls at all hours, some supportive, many threatening. "I hope you die, you lying bee," followed by words that made her hands shake as she blocked the numbers. She disconnected her landline after a particularly graphic death threat left on her voicemail. Judith drove over from her house 2 hours away, took one look at Joan's gaunt face and the dark circles under her eyes, and didn't leave. She moved into Joan's spare bedroom, temporarily, bringing groceries and forcing Joan to eat, answering the phone so Joan didn't have to hear the hate. "You can't keep living like this," Judith said one night, finding Joan at 3 a.m. scrolling through hateful comments on her laptop. "Joan, this is killing you." "I can't stop now," Joan whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "If I stop, it means they win. It means all those patients. What about you? When does what you're going through mean something? When do you matter?" Joan had no answer for that. Her savings evaporated faster than she'd calculated. Legal fees, basic living expenses without any income. She applied to dozens of jobs. Not in pharmaceuticals, she wasn't that naive, but entry-level positions at retail stores, administrative roles, anything. Not one callback. Google her name, and the first results were Meridian's press releases calling her a liar and a thief. She was unhireable, unemployable, being erased from professional existence. Joan started selling things: her good furniture, her television, jewelry she'd inherited from her mother. Each item felt like losing a piece of herself, but the legal bills kept coming, and the savings account kept shrinking towards zero. 2 months after the article published, she had a panic attack so severe that Judith rushed her to the emergency room, convinced Joan was having a heart attack. The ER doctor checked her heart, which was fine physically, and looked at her blood pressure readings with alarm. "Your blood pressure is dangerously high. You're under enormous stress. You need to eliminate the source immediately, or you're at serious risk of stroke or heart attack." In the sterile ER room, hooked up to monitors, Joan finally broke. She sobbed so hard she couldn't breathe, all the fear and exhaustion and terror pouring out of her. Judith held her, crying too, begging her to let it go. "Please, Joan, please, I can't lose you. I can't watch you kill yourself for this. They're not worth your life." Joan wanted to quit. God, how she wanted to quit. To sign Meridian's settlement offer, take their money, and try to rebuild what was left of her life. She was 62 years old, unemployed, nearly broke, her health failing. What more could she possibly give? That night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion, Joan did something she'd been avoiding. She went online and searched for patient forums about the medication she'd tried to stop. The forums were full of people discussing their experiences. Most were positive or neutral. But then she found a thread that made her blood run cold. "Has anyone else had seizures on this medication?" The responses multiplied, page after page of people describing serious reactions: seizures, cardiac arrhythmias, severe allergic responses, and over, the same confused question: "My doctor said this was supposed to be so safe. Why didn't anyone warn us?" Joan clicked through profile after profile, reading stories that broke her heart. A mother whose 16-year-old daughter had a seizure while driving and crashed her car. A man who'd developed a heart condition that might be permanent. A young woman who'd spent 3 days in intensive care. These weren't statistics. They were people. Real people who'd trusted that someone had ensured their medication was safe. One post stopped Joan cold. A mother had posted a photo of her daughter, a beautiful teenage girl with her whole life ahead of her. Emma had her first seizure 2 weeks after starting this medication. The doctors said it was rare, that we were just unlucky. But looking at this forum, it's not rare at all, is it? How many people have been hurt? Why didn't anyone warn us? Joan stared at Emma's photo, at her bright smile and innocent eyes, and something crystallized inside her. She wasn't fighting for abstract principles anymore. She was fighting for Emma. For every patient in those forums who deserved to know the truth. For every person who would trust that 2.3% number because Meridian had hidden the real data. Joan closed her laptop and deleted the email draft she'd started to her lawyer about accepting the settlement. Instead, she wrote to Christian Hunt, "I need the names and contact information for everyone who was harmed by this medication. We're going to make sure they know they weren't alone and they weren't wrong. And we're going to make sure Meridian faces every single one of them." The next morning, Joan woke up with new purpose. She was terrified, exhausted, nearly broke, But she wasn't beaten. Not yet. Christian connected her with a patient advocacy attorney who worked on contingency. Together, they started building a case, not just Joan's employment claims, but a class action lawsuit representing everyone harmed by Meridian's fraud. The process was grueling. Joan spent hours on the phone with patients, listening to their stories, documenting their experiences. Each conversation was heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. These people had been harmed by a medication that should have carried stronger warnings, that should have had its risks honestly reported. And all of it could have been prevented if Meridian had been honest. 3 months after Christian's initial article, federal regulators announced they were opening an investigation into Meridian's safety reporting practices. The announcement was careful and bureaucratic, but the message was clear. Joan's allegations were being taken seriously. Meridian's stock price dropped 15% in a single day. That should have felt like victory, but Joan was too exhausted to celebrate. She'd lost 30 pounds. Her hair had gone completely gray. She looked like a ghost of her former self. Then Meridian escalated. A PI firm had been digging through Joan's past, and they'd found everything. Her DUI from 1994, a workers' compensation claim from 2003 for carpal tunnel syndrome, a complaint filed by a former colleague in 2009 about Joan being difficult to work with during a stressful project. All of it was leaked to the media with sinister framing. Whistleblower has criminal record. Pattern of workplace conflicts suggests interpersonal issues. History of claims against employer raises questions about motivations. The media coverage shifted. Suddenly, Joan wasn't just a whistleblower. She was a complicated figure with credibility issues. Opinion pieces debated whether her past mistakes undermined her current claims. Talk shows invited experts to analyze her psychology. Joan watched her reputation being systematically demolished, every mistake and weakness magnified and weaponized. She felt like she was being flayed alive in public. The worst moment came when her nephew, Judith's son, Michael, called. He worked in pharmaceutical sales, and his company had called him in for a meeting. They'd suggested he distance himself from his aunt if he wanted to keep his job and advance his career. "I told them to go to hell," Michael said, his voice tight with anger. "But Aunt Joan, I wanted you to know what they're doing. They're not just coming after you, they're threatening your family." Joan felt the guilt crush her. "Michael, if you need to distance yourself, I understand. I don't want my problems to hurt you. Mom would kill me if I abandoned you. We're family. We stick together." But Joan heard the strain in his voice, heard what this was costing him. She wasn't just destroying her own life, she was damaging everyone who stood by her. That night, Joan sat with Judith in her tiny apartment, now sparsely furnished because she'd sold so much to pay bills. "Tell me to stop," Joan said. "Tell me it's not worth it, that I should take the settlement and end this. I need someone to give me permission to quit." Judith was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you remember when Dad was fighting the factory? How Mom begged him to stop, to think about us kids, to just accept the layoffs and find another job. He wouldn't stop. It destroyed him. No, the factory destroyed him. But his choice, the choice to fight, that's what let him look us in the eye. That's what let him teach us that standing up matters even when it costs everything." Judith took Joan's hand. "I'm terrified for you. I want you to stop because I don't want to lose my sister. But I can't tell you to quit, because then I'd be asking you to become someone you're not, someone you couldn't live with being." Joan cried then, not from despair, but from overwhelming gratitude for a sister who understood. "I'm so tired, Judy. I know, but you're not alone, and you're not wrong. Those patients, those people who were hurt, they need someone to fight for them. You're all they have." The breaking point came in November, 4 months after Joan's termination. The federal investigation expanded based on evidence Joan and Stephen had provided. Regulatory inspectors descended on Meridian's headquarters, seizing documents and interviewing employees. And suddenly the dam broke. Donna Martinez requested a meeting with Joan at a coffee shop far from Meridian's offices. Joan almost didn't go. The betrayal still stung. But curiosity won out. Donna looked like she'd aged 5 years in 6 months. She slid a folder across the table to Joan with shaking hands. "I owe you an apology. I knew what was happening, and I stayed silent. I told myself I was being practical, protecting my family, but I was protecting my comfort, my paycheck, my cowardice." Her voice broke. "I watched them destroy you, and I did nothing." Joan opened the folder. Inside was documentation Donna had been collecting for 5 years. HR complaints that were buried, safety concerns that were ignored, employees who were pushed out for asking questions. It was a roadmap of institutional corruption. "Why now?" Joan asked. "Because I can't sleep. Because every time I see my grandchildren, I think about those patients who were hurt, and I know I could have stopped it. Because watching you stand up, even after they destroyed your life, I realized that surviving with your soul intact matters more than surviving comfortably." Donna looked at Joan with desperate eyes. "I can't testify publicly. I have a daughter in college, aging parents who depend on me financially, but you can use this, all of it. I need you to know you were right, and you weren't alone." Joan took the folder, and with it, crucial evidence from inside HR showing that Meridian's leadership had known about the safety concerns and actively suppressed them. 2 days later, another email arrived in Joan's inbox. This one from Amber Nelson, sent from a personal address. "Ms. Miller, I need to talk to you. I quit Meridian. I couldn't do what they were asking me to do. I have information you need." They met at the same coffee shop. Amber looked haunted, thinner than Joan remembered. "They gave me your old job," Amber said without preamble. "Promoted me to senior compliance officer. I was so excited. Proof that hard work pays off, that I'd made it. Except it wasn't a promotion. It was a setup." She explained how they'd pressured her to sign off on questionable reports, just like they'd pressured Joan. How she'd tried to push back and been told to be a team player. How she'd watched them use her, a young woman of color, as a shield, proof that Meridian valued diversity and integrity even as they corrupted everything those words meant. "I kept thinking about you," Amber said, tears streaming down her face. "About how you stood up in that meeting, about what it cost you, and I realized I couldn't do it. I couldn't become what they wanted me to become. So I quit. And now I'm unemployed with student loans and no prospects, but at least I can look at myself in the mirror." Joan reached across the table and took the young woman's hand. "You made the right choice. It's the hardest choice, but it's the right one." "Was it worth it?" Amber asked. "For you, losing everything. Was it worth it?" Joan thought about the patient forums, about Emma's photo, about the investigation that was finally holding Meridian accountable. "Ask me again when this is over," she said, "but I think it might be." With Donna's documentation and Amber's testimony about recent pressures, Christian published a follow-up article. This one was even more damaging, showing that the corruption wasn't historical. It was ongoing, systematic, and went all the way to the top. The article included quotes from 3 other anonymous current employees who corroborated everything. The silent majority was finding its voice, emboldened by Joan's stand. Within a week, congressional staffers reached out. The House Committee on Oversight and Reform was holding hearings on pharmaceutical industry safety reporting. They wanted Joan to testify. Joan sat in her apartment holding the official congressional subpoena and tried to process what it meant. She was going to testify before Congress. Her face would be on C-SPAN. Her story would be part of the official record. And Meridian would have one final chance to destroy her credibility in the most public forum imaginable. "Can I do this?" she asked Judith, who'd stayed with her through everything. "You've done everything else. You can do this, too." The hearing was scheduled for December 15th. Joan had 3 weeks to prepare. Christian helped her organize her testimony, reviewing documents and timelines until Joan could recite them in her sleep. Stephen Collins worked with her on anticipating attacks, running through every possible criticism Meridian's lawyers might raise. Patricia, her attorney, was more blunt. They're going to try to destroy you on national television. Everything they've done privately, they'll do publicly. Your DUI, your performance issues, your theft of documents, all of it will be used to paint you as unreliable, vindictive, and dishonest. You need to be prepared for that. Joan was as prepared as she could be, but nothing could truly prepare her for walking into that hearing room. The morning of December 15th was bitterly cold, the Washington sky gray and threatening snow. Joan stood outside the Rayburn House office building, flanked by Judith on one side and Christian on the other. Stephen Collins had arrived earlier, and they'd shared a moment of silent understanding. Two whistleblowers who'd lost everything, finally getting their chance to make it mean something. The hearing room was packed. Media filled the back rows, cameras everywhere. Patient advocates sat in the gallery, some holding photos of loved ones who'd been harmed. And there, in seats of honor, sat Meridian's legal team, 6 attorneys in expensive suits, armed with briefcases full of ammunition to destroy Joan's credibility. Ethan Harris himself sat behind them, looking every inch the aggrieved executive wrongly accused. Chapter 4. Joan took her seat at the witness table, alone despite the crowded room. She wore her best suit, the same one she'd worn for her 25-year service award, back when she'd believed loyalty and integrity would be rewarded. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the table, but her spine was straight. The committee chair, Senator Catherine Morrison, called the hearing to order. Her voice cut through the murmur of the crowd with authority. This committee convenes today to examine allegations of safety data manipulation in the pharmaceutical industry, with particular focus on Meridian Pharmaceuticals. Our first witness is Ms. Joan Elizabeth Miller, who served as Senior Compliance Officer at Meridian for 28 years before her termination in August of this year. Senator Morrison looked directly at Joan, and something in her expression was kind. Ms. Miller, thank you for your willingness to testify today. Please state your full name and former position for the record. Joan leaned toward the microphone, her voice steadier than she'd expected. Joan Elizabeth Miller. I was Senior Compliance Officer at Meridian Pharmaceuticals from 1997 to 2025, 28 years. Thank you. Before we begin questioning, you'll have an opportunity to make an opening statement. Please proceed. Joan had memorized her statement, but now, looking out at the packed room, at the cameras and the faces and the weight of this moment, the rehearsed words felt wrong. She set aside her prepared notes and spoke from the heart. Members of the committee, I spent 28 years believing that the system worked, that if you followed the rules, did your job with integrity, and stood up for what was right, you'd be protected. I was wrong. She paused, gathering her thoughts, letting the words settle. I didn't come here today seeking revenge against Meridian Pharmaceuticals. I came here because there are patients, real people with families and futures, who were harmed by medication that should have carried stronger warnings. Medication whose risks were deliberately hidden from the doctors prescribing it and the patients taking it. I came here because I believe those patients deserved better. They deserved the truth. Joan's voice grew stronger as she continued. In March of this year, I discovered that adverse event reports for Meridian's flagship autoimmune medication had been systematically altered. Serious reactions that required hospitalization were reclassified as moderate. Adverse events that federal law requires be reported to the FDA simply disappeared from final documentation. The internal safety data showed a 15.8% adverse event rate. The report submitted to regulators showed 2.3%. She looked directly at the senators. I didn't go to the media first. I didn't hire a lawyer. I followed every proper channel. I reported my concerns to my supervisor. I brought them to human resources. I requested meetings with executive leadership. And at every turn, I was told to be practical, to be a team player, to understand the bigger picture. When I refused to sign off on falsified reports, I was demoted, isolated, and eventually terminated. Joan pulled out a document and held it up. This is my termination letter. It cites gross insubordination and conduct detrimental to the company. My crime was refusing to lie about patient safety. For that, I lost my job, my pension, and my reputation. Meridian has sued me for $2 million. Not because they expect to win, but because they want to financially destroy me as a warning to anyone else who might consider speaking up. She set the letter down and looked out at the room. But here's what they couldn't take from me: the truth. I have documentation of every claim I've made. I have the original incident reports and the altered versions. I have emails discussing how to manage regulatory concerns. I have testimony from other employees who witnessed the same corruption. And most importantly, I have the stories of patients who were harmed by the very medication I tried to stop. Joan's voice caught with emotion. I'm 62 years old. I'm unemployed and nearly broke. My career is over. I'll probably never work in my field again, but I can look myself in the mirror. I can sleep at night knowing that I did everything I could to protect patients. That's worth more than any pension, any reputation, any career. She paused, then added quietly, My father was a union organizer who lost everything fighting for what was right. He taught me that silence in the face of wrong is its own kind of wrong. I'm not a hero. I'm just a woman who couldn't stay silent anymore. And I hope that by being here today, I can give courage to every other person working in corporate America who sees corruption and feels powerless to stop it. You're not powerless. Your voice matters, and you're stronger than you think. Joan sat back. The room was absolutely silent. Senator Morrison nodded slowly. Thank you, Ms. Miller. That was powerful testimony. Let's begin with questions. Can you walk us through the specific timeline of when you first identified the safety data discrepancies? Joan spent the next hour detailing everything. The dates, the reports, the meetings, the escalating pressure. She pulled out document after document, each one backing up her claims. The committee counsel helped her present side-by-side comparisons of internal safety reports versus what was submitted to the FDA. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. Then it was time for Meridian's legal team to cross-examine. The lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Richard Sterling, stood with the confidence of someone who'd destroyed witnesses before. Ms. Miller, isn't it true that you were placed on a performance improvement plan 3 weeks before the incident you describe? Yes. And isn't it true that this performance improvement plan cited multiple professional shortcomings? It cited subjective complaints that appeared only after I raised safety concerns. For 27 years and 50 weeks, my performance was exemplary. Then suddenly I was incompetent. Sterling's smile was thin. Or perhaps your performance had been declining, and raising these allegations was an attempt to distract from your professional failures. If that were true, my allegations would be false. But I have documentation proving every claim. If I were trying to distract from poor performance, I chose a remarkably elaborate and provable lie. Some people in the gallery laughed. Sterling's jaw tightened. Ms. Miller, you have a criminal record, don't you? Joan had been prepared for this, but it still stung. I was arrested for DUI in 1994 during my divorce. I completed all court-mandated requirements. It was 31 years ago, and I haven't had so much as a speeding ticket since. And yet you want this committee to believe you're a paragon of virtue? Joan leaned forward, her voice steady. No, Mr. Sterling. I want this committee to believe I'm a human being who made mistakes and learned from them, which is more than I can say for Meridian's leadership. I own my past. Can your clients say the same about theirs? Sterling changed tactics. You secretly recorded your supervisor, didn't you? I recorded a conversation with the CEO in which he explicitly told me to falsify federal safety reports. Yes. Without his knowledge or consent, you betrayed his trust. He betrayed the trust of every patient who relies on honest safety reporting. I'd make that trade again. You stole proprietary documents from the company. I preserved evidence of federal crimes. There's a difference. Sterling's frustration was visible now. Ms. Miller, isn't the truth that you're a disgruntled employee who couldn't accept your own failures and decided to burn down the company rather than take responsibility? Joan removed her reading glasses, a gesture that had become habitual when she needed to say something important. She looked directly at Sterling, then past him to Ethan Harris. Let me be very clear, because I want there to be no confusion. I'm a 62-year-old woman who spent 28 years believing that doing the right thing mattered within the system. I followed every rule, every protocol, every chain of command, and when I discovered that patient safety reports were being falsified, I tried to address it internally. I went to my supervisor, I went to HR, I went to the CEO, I was told to be practical, I was told to think about shareholders, I was told to consider my retirement. Her voice grew stronger, filled with conviction. What I was never told was the truth, that Meridian Pharmaceuticals had been systematically burying safety concerns for years, and I was just the latest person expected to look the other way. So yes, I took documents because they were going to destroy them. Yes, I recorded a conversation because without proof, it would be my word against a CEO with unlimited legal resources. And yes, I violated confidentiality agreements because those agreements were being used to hide harm from the public. She turned to face the committee directly. Mr. Sterling wants to paint me as vindictive and dishonest, but vindictive people don't spend 6 months being destroyed for telling the truth. Dishonest people don't document everything and present it to federal regulators and congressional committees. I'm not a perfect person, but I'm an honest one, and that's more than I can say for the leadership of Meridian Pharmaceuticals. The room erupted in scattered applause, quickly gavelled down by Senator Morrison, but the message was clear. Joan's testimony was resonating. Senator Morrison leaned forward. Ms. Miller, we've reviewed the documentation you provided, the recording you mentioned. Do you have it available? Yes, Senator. I'd like the committee to hear it if there are no objections. Sterling stood quickly. We object strenuously. This recording was made without Mr. Harris's knowledge and— This is a congressional hearing, not a trial, Mr. Sterling. Senator Morrison cut him off. We're here to find truth, not observe technical evidentiary rules. The recording is relevant to our investigation. We'll hear it. Joan's hands shook slightly as she provided the audio file. The committee's technical staff set it up, and then Ethan Harris's voice filled the room, crystal clear and damningly casual. Joan, patient safety is a luxury we can't afford right now. Sign the reports, reclassify the incidents, and we'll all keep our jobs. Refuse, and I'll make sure you never work in this industry again. Joan's voice. You're asking me to break federal law. Ethan's laugh. I'm asking you to be practical. Nobody gets hurt if nobody knows. And besides, these classification decisions are judgment calls. We have experts who agree with our assessments. Joan, the experts who disagree have all been fired. Ethan, they were fired for other reasons. Come on, Joan, 27 years you've been a team player. Don't go rogue on me now, not when we're this close to the finish line. The recording ended. The silence in the room was deafening. Senator Morrison looked at Ethan Harris, who'd gone pale. Mr. Harris, that certainly doesn't sound like the statements of a CEO committed to patient safety. Before Ethan could respond, another senator jumped in. Ms. Miller, you mentioned other employees who witnessed similar pressure. Are any of them willing to testify? Yes, Senator. Stephen Collins, who was terminated 2 years ago for raising similar concerns, is here today. And I have written testimony from other current and former employees who were afraid to come forward publicly but wanted their voices heard. The committee spent the next 2 hours reviewing documentation, listening to Stephen Collins' testimony, reading statements from anonymous employees, each piece of evidence built on the last, creating an overwhelming picture of systematic corruption. Then came the moment Joan had been waiting for and dreading. A senator from Meridian's home state, someone known to be friendly to pharmaceutical companies, leaned forward. "Ms. Miller, I'm troubled by your testimony, but I'm also troubled by the broader implications. If we make it too easy for disgruntled employees to level allegations like this, won't that harm innovation? Won't it make companies afraid to take necessary risks?" Joan had known this question was coming. She'd prepared for it. But now, sitting at this table with the weight of everything she'd lost pressing down on her, she found herself answering from a deeper place. "Senator, with respect, there's a difference between innovation risk and patient safety. Nobody is saying pharmaceutical companies shouldn't innovate or take calculated risks in drug development. But hiding adverse event data isn't innovation, it's fraud. Silencing employees who raise safety concerns isn't risk management, it's criminal conspiracy." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You ask if we're making it too easy to level allegations. I would ask, are we making it too hard? I lost my job, my pension, my reputation, and nearly my health for telling the truth. I've been sued for $2 million I don't have. I've received death threats. My family has been threatened. Does that sound too easy?" Joan's voice grew passionate. "What we should be asking is why it's so hard. Why do whistleblowers have to risk everything to protect public safety? Why do corporations have more rights than the employees who try to stop them from breaking the law? Why is it easier to destroy the messenger than address the message?" She looked directly at the senator. "I don't want to make it easy to file false allegations. I want to make it possible to file true ones without being financially and professionally destroyed. I want the next person who sees what I saw to know they won't be alone, that the system will protect them instead of the corporation that's breaking the law. Because right now, Senator, the system protects the powerful and punishes the principled, and that's not innovation. That's corruption." The room erupted in applause again, louder this time. Senator Morrison had to gavel for order, but even she looked moved. After another hour of testimony and questions, Senator Morrison announced a recess. Joan was ushered to a private room where Judith immediately wrapped her in a hug. "You were incredible," Judith whispered. "Dad would have been so proud." Joan collapsed into a chair, shaking from adrenaline. "Did I do enough? Was it enough?" Christian Hunt, who'd been watching from the gallery, came in with a grim smile. "You did more than enough. That recording, Joan, that's going to be on every news channel tonight. Ethan Harris just committed perjury about 6 times in his previous sworn statements. The board will have to act. And act they did." Before the day was over, 3 board members publicly called for Ethan Harris's resignation. By the next morning, it was 5. Major institutional investors demanded an independent investigation. The stock price plummeted 20%. 3 days after the hearing, Ethan Harris resigned. The official statement said he was stepping down to spend more time with family, but everyone knew the truth. He'd been forced out. 2 weeks later, federal prosecutors announced criminal charges against Ethan and 2 other senior executives: securities fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to defraud the FDA. Each charge carried years in prison. Meridian's new interim leadership issued a public apology and announced a complete overhaul of their safety reporting systems. They dropped the lawsuit against Joan and offered to restore her full pension with interest. They even offered her a consulting position, which Joan declined with a letter that was polite but firm. "I'm done working for companies that need to be watched, but I appreciate the gesture." What she didn't decline was the position offered by the Coalition for Patient Safety, a nonprofit that helped other whistleblowers navigate the impossible system Joan had just survived. The pay was a fraction of what she'd made at Meridian, but the work mattered in ways corporate compliance never had. Take a moment and subscribe if you're not already part of our community. Stories like Joan's remind us why truth matters, even when the cost seems unbearable. Let's finish this journey together. The months that followed were a blur of media appearances, speaking engagements, and late nights helping other whistleblowers find their courage. Joan became an unexpected advocate, her story giving permission to others who'd seen corruption and felt powerless to fight it. Stephen Collins joined her at the coalition, finally getting the second chance he desperately needed. They worked side by side, two survivors who understood the cost of speaking up and the even higher cost of staying silent. Amber Nelson went back to school for a master's in public health policy, determined to fix the system from the outside since she couldn't change it from within. She and Joan stayed in touch, the mentorship relationship resuming with new depth and mutual respect. Even Donna Martinez found her courage. She testified in the federal case against Meridian's executives, providing the HR documentation that proved they'd known about the safety issues and actively suppressed them. It cost her job. She was forced to resign, but she told Joan later that it was worth it. "I can finally sleep at night." 6 months after the hearing, Joan stood in a federal courtroom watching Ethan Harris being sentenced. He received 3 years in prison and a lifetime ban from serving in pharmaceutical company leadership. The judge's words echoed in the silent courtroom. "Mr. Harris, you built a career on the backs of employees like Ms. Miller, who did the difficult work of maintaining ethical standards while you reaped the rewards of their integrity. When those employees refused to compromise patient safety, you destroyed them systematically and without remorse. This sentence reflects not just your crimes, but the culture of corruption you created and the lives you damaged in service of profit." Joan sat in the gallery with Judith beside her and Stephen on her other side. She didn't feel triumph, just exhausted relief that it was finally over, that Ethan Harris would face consequences, that the system, broken as it was, had eventually produced something like justice. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed her. Joan had gotten better at these moments, learned to speak in sound bites without losing the truth of what she wanted to say. "Ms. Miller, how do you feel about the sentence?" "I feel like justice was served, though no sentence can undo the harm that was done. My hope is that this sends a message. You can't silence truth forever, and the people you try to silence, we're stronger than you think." "Do you have any regrets?" Joan paused, considering the question honestly. "I regret that it took so long. I regret that patients were harmed before we could stop it. I regret that speaking up had to cost so much. But do I regret speaking up? Never. Not for a second. What's next for you? Helping the next person who faces what I faced, making sure they know they're not alone, and they don't have to be destroyed to do the right thing. We're pushing for stronger whistleblower protections, legislation that would make it illegal to retaliate the way Meridian retaliated against me. Some people are calling it Jones Law." She smiled slightly. "I never wanted to be the face of anything. I just wanted to do my job with integrity. But if my story can protect even one other person from going through what I went through, then maybe it was all worth it." That night, Joan sat in her apartment, still modest, but it felt like home now, and opened her laptop. An email sat in her inbox from a compliance officer at another pharmaceutical company. Subject line, "I need advice. I found something wrong." Joan read the message. The young woman described safety concerns being buried, pressure to stay quiet, fear of retaliation. The story was heartbreakingly familiar. Joan remembered sitting at her own desk, hand hovering over the mouse, terrified to click send on the email that would change everything. She remembered the fear, the isolation, the crushing weight of choosing between security and conscience. She began typing her response. "I'm going to tell you the truth. Speaking up will cost you, but staying silent will cost you more. Here's what you need to know." She spent an hour crafting her response, sharing the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd walked through fire and come out the other side. She told the woman about documenting everything, about finding allies, about preparing for retaliation, but mostly, she told her that she wasn't alone. When she clicked send, Joan felt a sense of purpose that her 28 years at Meridian had never quite provided. She wasn't just doing a job anymore. She was part of something bigger, a growing movement of people who refused to let fear silence truth. The next morning, Joan met with a group of other whistleblowers, healthcare workers, government employees, corporate managers who'd all seen corruption and spoken up at enormous personal cost. They met weekly now, sharing strategies and support, building a network of people who understood the unique isolation of standing alone against powerful institutions. One woman, a nurse, who'd reported patient care violations, said what they were all thinking. "I lost my career. My colleagues think I'm a traitor. My family doesn't understand why I couldn't just keep my head down. But you know what? I can look at myself in the mirror now. I couldn't before." Joan nodded, understanding completely. That's the thing nobody tells you about whistleblowing. They focus on what you lose, your job, your reputation, your security. They don't talk about what you gain, peace, the peace of knowing you did everything you could, the peace of integrity. She paused, looking around at the faces of people who'd all paid the price for refusing to be silent. We're not heroes. We're just people who reached a point where the cost of silence was higher than the cost of speaking up, and that's enough. A year after her testimony, Joan was invited back to Washington for the signing of new whistleblower protection legislation. The bill wasn't perfect. Corporate lobbying had weakened some provisions, but it was progress. It created stronger protections against retaliation, provided legal assistance for whistleblowers, and established penalties for companies that used slap suits to silence employees. Joan stood in the White House ceremony room, watching the president sign the legislation that had been informally dubbed Joan's Law. It felt surreal, impossible. A year ago, she'd been unemployed and nearly broke, watching her life crumble. Now she was being honored for the same actions that had once destroyed her. But the honor didn't erase the cost. Her career in pharmaceuticals was permanently over. Her retirement had been delayed by years. She still had occasional panic attacks when she thought about how close she'd come to losing everything. Yet when reporters asked if it had been worth it, Joan's answer was always the same: yes. Because she'd discovered something in that fire. Courage isn't something you have. It's something you practice. Every small act of integrity prepares you for the bigger ones. Every time you speak a difficult truth, you strengthen that muscle. And she'd learned that you can't do it alone. The people who'd stood beside her, Judith, Stephen, Christian, Donna eventually, Amber, the anonymous employees, who'd sent her evidence. They'd made the unbearable bearable. 2 months after the White House ceremony, Joan returned to Meridian's headquarters for the first time since her termination. The company's new leadership had invited her to address employees as part of their ethics overhaul. Walking back into that building felt like returning to a crime scene. Joan stood in the lobby where she'd once swiped her badge every morning, now a visitor who needed an escort. The elevator rose to the 14th floor, not to her old office, but to the auditorium where she'd stood up and asked her question a lifetime ago. The room was packed with employees, many of whom had been there that day. Joan saw recognition in their faces, curiosity, and in some cases, shame. She stood on the same stage where Ethan Harris had once proclaimed victory and took a breath. A year and a half ago, I stood in this room and asked a question that cost me everything. I lost my job, my pension, my reputation. I was sued, smeared, and nearly destroyed, and I'd do it again. The room was silent, every eye on her. I'm not here today to make you feel guilty for not standing with me. I understand why you didn't. The system is designed to make silence the rational choice. It punishes people who speak up and rewards people who look away. That's not your fault. That's the system's fault. She paused, making eye contact with people throughout the room. But I'm here to tell you that the system can change. It changed because enough people, employees like you, investigators, legislators, patients, decided that the cost of silence was too high. And it will keep changing if we keep demanding it. Joan's voice grew stronger, filled with hard-won wisdom. If you see something wrong in your work, you have choices. You can stay silent and keep your job. You can rationalize it, tell yourself it's not your responsibility, that one person can't make a difference. That's the easy choice, and I don't judge anyone who makes it. Self-preservation is human. She leaned forward, her intensity palpable. But I want you to know there's another choice. You can speak up. You can document what you see. You can report it through proper channels. And yes, it might cost you, but it might not cost you as much as it cost me, because the system has changed. There are stronger protections now. There are organizations that will support you. There are people like me who will stand beside you. Joan's voice softened. Most importantly, you'll be able to look yourself in the mirror. You'll be able to tell your children and grandchildren that when it mattered, you chose integrity over comfort. And that peace, the peace of knowing you did the right thing, that's worth more than any job title or pension. She concluded by looking directly at the youngest employees in the room. To the young people starting their careers, you have the power to build a different kind of corporate culture, one where speaking up doesn't require martyrdom, where doing the right thing is rewarded, not punished, where patient safety actually matters more than stock prices. But that culture only exists if you demand it, every single day, in every decision you make. The applause that followed was thunderous. Employees stood, many crying, some looking at each other as if seeing their workplace with new eyes. Afterward, a line of people waited to talk to her. Some thanked her. Some apologized for not supporting her when it happened. Some quietly asked for advice about concerns they had now. One young analyst, couldn't have been more than 25, approached nervously. "Ms. Miller, I saw something in my department that doesn't seem right. I don't know if it's serious enough to report, and I'm afraid to ask questions." Joan took the young woman's hand. "If it bothers you enough to mention it to me, it's serious enough to ask questions. And being afraid is normal. I was terrified every step of the way. But you know what? You're not alone anymore. Here's my card. Call me anytime. I'll help you figure out what to do." The woman's relief was palpable. That was the moment Joan knew, truly knew, that everything had been worth it. Because this young woman wouldn't have to walk the path alone the way Joan had. The road ahead was still hard, but at least now there were guardrails and guides and people who'd gone before. As Joan left Meridian's headquarters that day, she paused in the lobby. The building looked the same, all glass and marble in corporate grandeur. But something fundamental had shifted. The culture that had enabled Ethan Harris's corruption was being dismantled piece by piece. It would take years, maybe decades. Some people would resist the change. But the foundation had cracked, and light was finally getting in. Joan walked out into the afternoon sun, free of the building and everything it had represented, free of the need to prove herself, to climb the corporate ladder, to define her worth by her job title. She'd lost her career, but she'd found her voice. And in the end, that was the greater victory. Chapter 5. 8 months had passed since Joan's visit to Meridian. It was early autumn now, the air crisp with the promise of change. Joan sat in a small park near her apartment, watching leaves drift down from the trees, each one letting go and falling with quiet grace. Her phone buzzed with a text from Stephen Collins. "Patient Advocacy Conference next month. They want both of us as keynote speakers. You in?" Joan smiled and typed back, "Absolutely." The work never stopped. Every week brought new emails from people who'd seen corruption and didn't know what to do. Joan answered every single one, offered guidance to each person standing at the same crossroads she'd once faced. Some chose to speak up. Some chose silence. Joan supported both, understanding viscerally that courage looks different for everyone. Her life now was smaller in some ways than her corporate existence had been. She'd never have the corner office or the impressive title. Her apartment was modest. Her savings account would never be what it might have been if she'd signed those papers and kept her head down for 7 more years. But her life was also richer in ways she couldn't have imagined. The work she did at the Coalition for Patient Safety mattered in a direct, tangible way. When she helped a nurse report patient abuse, when she coached a government employee through blowing the whistle on fraud, when she stood beside someone walking the terrifying path she'd walked, that meant something. And she had peace. Not the comfortable peace of security, but the hard-won peace of integrity. The peace of knowing she'd done everything she could. Joan's phone rang. It was Judith, her weekly check-in that had become daily during the worst times and had settled into a comfortable rhythm now. "Hey, Judy. Just calling to see how you're doing. You sound good." "I am good. Really good, actually." Joan paused, realizing the truth of it. "I think I'm happier now than I was in all those years at Meridian. Isn't that strange?" Judith laughed. "Not strange at all. You're finally doing what you were meant to do. Dad would have loved this version of you." After they hung up, Joan thought about her father, about the union card still sitting on her desk, now in a frame alongside her congressional testimony transcript. Thomas Miller had lost his battle, but his daughter had won hers. Or maybe they'd both won in ways that couldn't be measured in salaries or pensions. Maybe winning wasn't about defeating the powerful. Maybe it was about refusing to become powerless, about standing up even when standing up cost everything, about leaving a path for others to follow. The coalition was pushing for even stronger whistleblower protections now, building on the momentum of Joan's law. They were working with legislators, patient advocates, labor unions, and ethical corporate leaders to create systems where speaking up didn't require martyrdom. It was slow work, frustrating work. Corporate lobbyists fought every provision, but progress was being made, one small victory at a time, and people were watching. Joan received messages from all over the country, employees who'd reported safety violations because they'd heard her story, compliance officers who'd stood up to pressure because they knew they weren't alone, even executives who'd implemented ethics reforms because they'd seen what happened to companies that lost their way. One email in particular had brought tears to Joan's eyes. It was from a mother whose daughter had been about to start the medication Joan had tried to stop. "We heard about the investigation and asked our doctor for alternatives. Your courage probably saved my child's life. Thank you." That was why it had all been worth it. Not the legislation or the media attention or the vindication, but that mother, that child, every patient who was protected because Joan had refused to stay silent. She thought about the moment that had started everything, sitting at her desk, staring at that email, hand hovering over the mouse. 2 clicks, 2 possible futures. She'd chosen the harder path, the one that cost her everything she thought she wanted, and she'd gained everything that actually mattered. Joan stood up from the park bench, ready to head home and prepare for tomorrow's meeting with a whistleblower who was just beginning their journey. She'd sit with them, listen to their fear, share her story, and help them find their courage. Because that was her purpose now. Not climbing corporate ladders or accumulating titles, but standing beside people at their moment of choice, reminding them they were stronger than they knew, braver than they believed, and never, ever alone. As she walked, Joan thought about all the people who'd told her she was brave. She never felt brave. She felt scared, exhausted, overwhelmed. But she'd learned that bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite fear. It's choosing truth over comfort, integrity over security, conscience over convenience. She thought about Donna Martinez, who'd found her courage late, but found it nonetheless. About Amber Nelson, rebuilding her career on a foundation of principles instead of ambition. About Stephen Collins, finally able to sleep at night knowing his sacrifice hadn't been for nothing. She thought about the anonymous employees who'd sent her evidence, risking their jobs to help her build her case, about the patient advocates who'd amplified her story, about Christian Hunt, who'd given her a platform when she had nothing. And she thought about Judith, who'd never wavered, never suggested giving up, who'd stood beside her through the darkest moments and reminded her why the fight mattered. Joan had been part of something bigger than herself, a movement of ordinary people refusing to accept corruption as inevitable, refusing to believe that doing the right thing had to mean professional suicide, building a world where integrity wasn't punished but protected. It wasn't finished. The work would never be completely finished. There would always be companies that prioritize profit over safety, always executives who believed rules were for other people, always systems that protected the powerful at the expense of the principled. But those systems could be changed, would be changed, by people like Joan who decided that silence was too expensive, who chose to speak even when speaking cost everything, who proved that one voice speaking truth could be louder than an army of people keeping quiet. A few blocks from her apartment, Joan passed a pharmacy. In the window was a poster warning about medication side effects, part of new FDA requirements that had come out of the Meridian investigation. The poster featured clear, honest information about risks and adverse events. It was a small thing. Most people probably didn't even notice it. But Joan saw it for what it was, proof that speaking up had mattered, that her suffering had produced something good, that patients were safer because she'd refused to sign those falsified reports. She walked on, her steps light despite everything she'd been through, despite the career that was gone, despite the financial security she'd never recover. Despite all of it, she felt free in a way she never had in that corner office, with her impressive title and her complicity. That night, Joan sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, responding to emails from people who needed help. Each message was a story of someone facing their own impossible choice. Each response was Joan passing forward the courage that others had given her. One email was from the young analyst she'd spoken to at Meridian. "Ms. Miller, I reported the concerns I mentioned. They're investigating now. I'm scared, but I know I did the right thing. Thank you for showing me it was possible." Joan typed back immediately. "I'm proud of you. Whatever happens next, you stood up when it mattered. That's something no one can take from you. Call me anytime you need support. You're not alone." She hit send, then sat back and looked at her father's union card on the wall. "We did it, Dad," she whispered. "We both did it." The journey from that moment at her desk, hand hovering, heart pounding, everything at stake, to this quiet evening in her modest apartment had been brutal. It had cost her almost everything she thought defined her: her career, her financial security, her professional identity, years of her life consumed by stress and fear and the crushing weight of fighting an institution designed to destroy her. But she'd won the battle that mattered. Not the battle for her job or her pension or her reputation. The battle for her soul, for the right to look herself in the mirror and see someone she respected, someone her father would have been proud of, someone she could be proud of. Joan closed her laptop and walked to her window, looking out over the city lights. Somewhere out there were people facing the same choice she'd faced, seeing corruption and deciding whether to speak or stay silent, weighing their security against their conscience. And maybe, just maybe, some of them would remember her story, would remember that a 62-year-old woman named Joan Miller had stood up when standing up seemed impossible, had lost everything and survived, had proven that truth, though costly, was worth the price. That thought gave her more satisfaction than 28 years of corporate success ever had. She thought about the question everyone always asked: was it worth it? People wanted a simple answer, a Hollywood ending where the hero triumphs and lives happily ever after, vindicated and rewarded. But life wasn't that simple. The truth was more complicated and more honest. Yes, it was worth it. But not because she won, not because Ethan Harris went to prison or because legislation passed or because she got her pension back. Those things mattered, but they weren't why it was worth it. It was worth it because she'd discovered who she really was. Not Joan Miller, senior compliance officer, not Joan Miller, corporate success story, but Joan Miller, woman of principle. Joan Miller, who'd rather lose everything than compromise on what mattered. She'd discovered that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, that she could survive the worst they could throw at her and still stand. That fear didn't have to be paralyzing. It could be clarifying, that the most terrifying moments of her life had also been the most defining. She'd learned that integrity wasn't something you talked about in ethics training. It was something you proved in the moment when everything was at stake, when staying silent was easier, when telling the truth cost everything. And she'd learned that she wasn't alone, that there were people everywhere, ordinary people doing ordinary jobs who saw wrong and wanted to make it right, who needed someone to show them it was possible, who were waiting for permission to be brave. Joan had become that permission, that proof, that example. Her phone buzzed with another email, another person at a crossroads, another impossible choice. Joan smiled and opened it, ready to walk beside someone else through their fire, because that was her work now, her calling, her purpose. Not preventing every act of corruption that was impossible, but preventing the isolation of every whistleblower. Making sure that when someone stood up, they knew others would stand with them. Creating a network of courage that grew stronger with every person who chose truth over comfort. It was slow work, patient work. The kind of work that measured success in individual lives changed, not in quarterly earnings or stock prices. And it was exactly the work Joan was meant to do. She thought about the young woman at Meridian who'd asked if speaking up was worth it, about Amber Nelson rebuilding her career on principle, about Stephen Collins finally finding peace, about Donna Martinez learning to sleep at night. They were all warriors in the same fight, all ordinary people who decided that silence was too expensive, that integrity mattered more than security, that some things were worth losing everything for, and they were winning, not quickly, not easily, but persistently, one whistleblower at a time, one investigation at a time, one piece of legislation at a time, one life saved at a time. Joan sat back down at her kitchen table and began typing a response to the latest person who needed guidance. She wrote with the authority of someone who'd been through the fire and emerged intact, who knew exactly how much it cost and why it was still worth it. "I'm going to tell you the truth," she wrote. "This path is hard, harder than you can imagine. You'll lose things you can't get back. You'll face opposition from people you thought were friends. You'll question yourself 1,000 times. But here's what else is true. You'll discover strength you didn't know you had. You'll find allies in unexpected places, and you'll be able to look yourself in the mirror without flinching. That last part, that's what makes it worth it." She continued typing, sharing practical advice about documentation, about finding lawyers, about protecting yourself financially. But mostly, she shared hope. The hope that speaking up didn't have to mean destruction, that the system was changing, that she would stand beside them through every step of the journey. When she finished and clicked send, Joan felt that familiar sense of purpose. This was what she'd been prepared for through 28 years of corporate compliance. Not to enable corruption, but to recognize it. Not to stay silent, but to know exactly what was at stake when she spoke up. Her entire career had been training for the moment she chose truth over comfort, and everything since then had been proof that the choice, though costly, had been right. Joan looked at the clock. It was late. She should sleep. Tomorrow would bring more emails, more people who needed help, more work to be done. But she felt energized in a way she never had during her corporate years. This work fed her soul instead of depleting it. She thought about a conversation she'd had with Stephen Collins last month. They'd been reviewing cases, helping whistleblowers navigate the legal and emotional minefield of speaking up. He'd looked at her and said, "Do you ever regret it? Really, truly regret it?" Joan had thought about the question seriously before answering. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that the system is broken enough that speaking up requires sacrifice. I regret every patient who was harmed before we could stop it. But do I regret my choice to speak up? No." Because the alternative was living as someone I couldn't respect, and that would have destroyed me more surely than anything Meridian did. Stephen had nodded. I spent 2 years regretting that I gave up, that I let them break me. Working with you, finishing what I started, that's given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Myself. Joan understood that completely. She'd lost Joan Miller, senior compliance officer. But she'd found Joan Miller, whole person. And that woman was someone she actually liked, someone who could face challenges without crumbling, someone who'd stared down corporate lawyers and federal senators and her own terror and emerged intact, someone strong. A notification popped up on her phone. The young analyst from Meridian had sent another message. Ms. Miller, they're retaliating against me. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. Joan immediately called her. The young woman answered on the first ring, her voice shaking. Talk to me, Joan said gently. What happened? For the next hour, Joan walked her through it, helped her document everything, explained her legal rights, connected her with attorneys who specialized in whistleblower cases. But mostly, she just listened. Let the young woman cry and rage and express all the fear and betrayal that came with discovering that doing the right thing came with consequences. I thought if I just presented the facts, they'd have to address it, the woman said, her voice breaking. I thought the truth would be enough. The truth is never enough on its own, Joan said softly. You need courage to speak it. You need allies to amplify it. You need persistence to defend it. But yes, truth is where it starts. And you spoke it. That took incredible bravery. I don't feel brave. I feel terrified. That's what brave looks like. Brave isn't feeling fearless. It's acting despite fear. Joan paused. Listen to me. You are not alone. I'm going to walk you through every step of this. You're going to survive this, and you're going to be stronger for it. I promise you. When they finally hung up, Joan sat in the quiet of her apartment, thinking about that young woman at the beginning of her journey, about all the people just starting down the path Joan had already traveled. She couldn't protect them from the hardship, couldn't spare them the cost, but she could make sure they weren't alone. And sometimes, that made all the difference. Joan went to her small desk and pulled out a journal she'd been keeping. In it, she documented every person she'd helped, every whistleblower who'd reached out, every case that was being built, every small victory in the larger war against corporate corruption. The list was growing. Dozens of people now, each one representing a choice for truth over comfort. Each one proof that her sacrifice had created ripples, spreading farther than she could measure. She added the young analyst's name to the list, then flipped back to the beginning. The first entry was her own. Joan Elizabeth Miller, Senior Compliance Officer, Meridian Pharmaceuticals, terminated for refusing to falsify safety reports, lost everything, found herself. Looking at those words now, Joan felt a surge of gratitude for the woman who'd clicked that mouse despite her terror, who'd stood up in that meeting despite knowing it would cost her, who'd testified before Congress despite the attacks on her character. That woman, past Joan, had given present Joan a life worth living, a purpose worth pursuing, a legacy worth leaving. Joan closed the journal and returned to her laptop. More emails had come in while she was on the phone, more people who needed guidance, more stories of corruption and conscience, more impossible choices. She answered each one with care, with empathy, with the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd survived what they were facing. With each response, she felt herself becoming more fully who she was meant to be. Not a corporate executive, not a whistleblower even, but a guide, a mentor, a voice in the darkness saying, "You can do this. I did it. Others have done it. You are not alone." As midnight approached, Joan finally closed her laptop. She stood at her window one last time, looking out at the city that had been her home through triumph and disaster, through success and destruction, through everything. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the woman she'd been, dutiful, compliant, believing that loyalty to institutions mattered more than loyalty to principles, about the woman she'd become, tested, tempered, transformed by fire into something stronger and truer, about all the people who'd walked this path with her, Judith, who'd never wavered in her support, Stephen, who'd found redemption in their shared fight, Christian, who'd given her a platform when she had nothing, Donna, who'd found her courage late but found it nonetheless, Amber, who'd chosen principle over ambition, the anonymous allies who'd risked everything to send her evidence, about the patients who'd been protected because she refused to stay silent, the young analyst she'd just spoken to, who wouldn't face the journey alone, every whistleblower who'd reached out and found support instead of isolation, about her father, who'd fought his battle and lost, but taught his daughter that fighting mattered more than winning. Joan touched her hand to the window, feeling the cool glass against her palm. "I understand now, Dad," she whispered. "It's not about whether you win. It's about whether you fight, whether you stand up when standing up is hard, whether you speak truth when silence is easier." She smiled, tears running down her face. "I stood up. I spoke truth, and I'm still standing." That was her victory. Not Ethan Harris in prison, not legislation bearing her name, not even her restored pension or public vindication, but this. Joan Miller, at 63 years old, standing in her modest apartment, unemployable in her former field, still recovering from the trauma of the fight, and at peace with who she was, at peace with the choices she'd made, at peace with the cost and the consequences and everything she'd been through, at peace. And that, she realized, was the whole point. The peace didn't come from winning. It came from knowing she'd done everything she could, from being able to look herself in the mirror and see someone worthy of respect, from being, finally and completely, herself. Joan turned away from the window and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people who needed help, new battles in the ongoing war for integrity and truth. But tonight, she would sleep the deep, dreamless sleep of someone with a clear conscience. She'd lost her career. She'd lost her financial security. She'd lost years of her life to stress and fear and the grinding weight of fighting an institution designed to destroy her. But she'd found something more valuable than all of it. She'd found her voice, and in finding her voice, she'd helped others find theirs. And in helping others find theirs, she'd discovered her purpose. Not to climb corporate ladders or accumulate titles or build impressive resumes, but to stand beside people in their darkest moments and remind them they were stronger than they knew, to prove that speaking up didn't have to mean facing destruction alone, to build a world where integrity was protected, not punished. That was work worth doing, work that mattered, work that gave meaning to everything she'd suffered. As Joan drifted off to sleep, her last thought was of the email she'd received earlier from the mother whose daughter she'd helped save. "Your courage probably saved my child's life." For that alone, for that single life protected, everything had been worth it. But it wasn't just one life. It was dozens, hundreds. Every patient who'd been warned about real risks because the system had been forced to change. Every whistleblower who'd spoken up because Joan had shown them it was possible. Every person who'd stood up to corruption because they knew they weren't alone. The ripples of one woman's choice spread farther than she could measure, touched more lives than she'd ever know, changed systems that had seemed unchangeable. All because Joan Miller, 62 years old, sitting at her desk with her hand hovering over a mouse, had clicked anyway, had chosen war over complicity, truth over comfort, integrity over security, had become, in that moment, exactly who she was meant to be, and in becoming that person, tested by fire, strengthened by suffering, transformed by her refusal to stay silent, she'd given permission to countless others to do the same. That was her legacy. Not the headlines or the legislation or the congressional testimony, but the quiet courage of ordinary people who saw her story and thought, if she could do it, maybe I can too. And one by one, they were proving it, speaking up, standing up, refusing to accept corruption as inevitable, building a world where Joan's sacrifice wouldn't be necessary, where the next person who saw something wrong wouldn't have to lose everything to make it right. That world wasn't here yet, might not be here for generations, but every whistleblower who spoke up, every person who chose truth, every small victory, they were building it together. And Joan Miller, the woman who'd lost her career but found her calling, was helping to lead the way. If Joan's story moved you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Have you ever faced a moment where speaking up felt impossible? Have you ever had to choose between comfort and conscience? Your stories matter. Share them below. And if this resonated with you, please subscribe to Weathered Rose Stories. Every week we share stories about women who found their strength in unexpected places. Hit that like button if you believe, like Joan does, that one person can make a difference. Thank you for being part of this community of truth seekers and courage finders. Before you go, take a moment to reflect. What would you do in Joan's position? What's the one truth you've been afraid to speak? You don't have to share it here. But maybe, like Joan, today is the day you stop being afraid of your own courage. Until next time, remember, you're stronger than you think, braver than you believe, and your voice matters more than you know.